welcome to another video. Today's video is going to be the second part of my March wrap-up. I will put the link to the video of my part 1 in the down bar down below, and I literally have about 20 minutes until I have to leave, so this is going to be very quick and very easy, I hope. First, I read Catch 22 by Joseph Heller, which is considered a classic, and it has been out for 50 years apparently. This one was surprising because people say to me that you either love this book or you hate it. It has been blurbed a lot, among others by Stephen King, who says that this is one of the best books he has ever read. So of course I was intrigued when I started reading. I will say though, it takes about 200 pages to really get into this story, which is a lot because it's about 500 pages, and 200 pages is a lot to get into a book. But once I got into it, I really enjoyed it. It's very confusing in the beginning, and you follow so many characters and you don't really get a sense of who they are. You just hear their names and then hear a story about them, and then you move on to the other character. Some of these stories were hilarious, and actually the thing that I love the most about this book is the fact that it has a funny take on the Second World War. We follow these soldiers who are pilots during the Second World War, and we especially follow Josimir, I think he's called, who doesn't want to be killed. He is part of a war, but he does not want to be killed. He wants to take no part in this war whatsoever. So this is basically about his struggle to not be killed. And as I said, I really enjoyed it and I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read another very hyped book, and that is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And I'm going to be unpopular right now because I did not like this book. I will say the beginning was very good, and that's also the part that I read about 5 years ago. I read 100 pages and then for some reason I put it down and I never picked it back up. But I did so this month, and I kind of shouldn't have, because the beginning was my favorite part of the book. The rest of the book went downhill for me and I ended up really disliking, especially the main character. We follow Pip, who lives in this very poor home in the beginning, and then suddenly he comes into money and he becomes wealthy. So we follow his adventures as a wealthy man in London, and that premise sounds interesting to me, so that's why I picked it up. However, I don't like the way Pip develops. His personality becomes very nasty, very uninteresting and boring, I would say, and very typical for a rich man, and I didn't really like it. There were some aspects of this book that I really liked, some Victorian aspects, and I'm not going to go too much into detail with those, but all in all, I really didn't like this book. I found myself very bored throughout most of the book, so I ended up giving it 2 stars. Then I was in the mood for another classic, and that is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and this one also contains the second novel, Through the Looking Glass. Now this one was great entertainment. I actually don't remember. I think I ended up giving it 4 or 5 stars because I really enjoyed it. Throughout the book I was thinking to myself, how can this man, Lewis Carroll, how can he come up with all of these creative things? I couldn't handle it. I thought it was such a genius piece of work to read, and as I said, I really enjoyed it. Definitely pick it up if you have any interest in the book. I will say I preferred the first story, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but the second one was very enjoyable as well. Then I decided to pick up an e-book on my Kindle, and that is Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters. Now, I had kind of forgotten about the fact that Sarah Waters writes LGBT books, I think that's what it's called, and I was very interested to read one of her books, especially because of that. I had forgotten about it when I started reading this book, but I quickly found out and I enjoyed it. This was very different from what I usually read. It basically deals with the main character who falls in love with a woman, and she is a woman herself. She's about 18 years old, and we follow their relationship and what happens to them in London and around London. I really loved the beginning. The beginning was enchanting. I couldn't stop reading, but then something happened and it all turned too, I don't know, chaotic for my taste, and I had a hard time following whatever the main character was doing, following her decisions. I didn't really understand her, and the ending was a bit of a fade out for me. I didn't like the way it turned out. I felt like Sarah Water could have gone in so many interesting directions with this story, and she kind of chose the easy way out. So in the end, I gave this book 3 stars. I really enjoyed it, but at the same time there were some parts in it that I didn't really enjoy. Okay, I have about 10 minutes left until I have to go. The next 2 books I read are the first 2 books in a series written by a Swedish guy called Jan Guillou. We have Brobyggerne, which I don't know how to translate into English, and then we have Dandy. Now this is a series of, until now it's about 4 books. I don't know if a 5th book will be out eventually, but I read the first 2, and it is basically a series about Europe during the 20th century, and we follow 3 brothers who grow up together, but then suddenly they are split, and that's where the story takes off. I found the first book very interesting because we follow one brother in Africa where he shoots lions, and I really enjoyed those stories, and we follow another brother who builds bridges in Norway during these very heavy and windy snowstorms. So I found those aspects very interesting to read about, very educating as well. I know this is fiction, but I still learned a lot about how you live in Norway and in Africa. So this book I rated 4 stars. And then the second book I rated 3 stars because this is more about the upper wealthy class. I enjoy reading about that class in general, but this book became kind of boring in some parts. So as I said, I gave it 3 stars, but I still really enjoyed it, and I'm actually super excited to continue on with the series. I have the next 2 books here on my shelves, and they are screaming for me to continue. I really enjoy the series, and it has kind of surprised me a bit. Okay, 2 more books to go. Next, I picked up a review copy that I received some months ago, so I thought that it would be time for me to actually read it, and that is Nightblade by Garrett Robinson. This is a young adult fantasy novel, and I believe it is self-published, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this book was interesting because while I enjoyed it, and while I appreciated this fantasy story, I was also very bored in some parts. I felt like the author was way too descriptive in some parts, and I didn't need all of these descriptions. I wanted for the story to move on, and it did eventually, but it took some time. Basically, this is about a main character called Loreen, I think it's pronounced, and she wants to move away from home and be independent, and she eventually becomes a thief. That's an interesting fantasy story. I mean, it's not something you haven't heard of before. I'm thinking kind of, what is it called? The Lies of Locke Lamora when I think of this premise. But still, I wanted to pick it up and read it because I like some fantasy reads now and then. This is interesting because I rated this book 3 stars, but I didn't finish it, so I'm kind of cheating. I did finish most of it, but the last 100 pages I skimmed because I knew what was coming, and when I skimmed the pages, I found out that I was right. This was kind of predictable, and I didn't want to waste any more hours on the ending because I knew what was coming and I was not interested in reading about it. This is a great book if you haven't read a lot of fantasy. If you are maybe 15 or 16 years old and you want to read a great fantasy story, then this is really good. But I have read so much fantasy lately, so I felt like this was heavy with cliches, and we have this main character who has a struggle inside of her. She wants to become independent, and she wants to be this fierce protagonist, which is great for a fantasy story and every other story. But I just felt like I've read about this before, and then she follows some people and she goes on this adventure, and I've read about it before. So all in all, I can see this is a great book for a new fantasy reader, but for me it was just meh. And the very last book I have to talk about is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. This is another classic, which is part of the BBC Top 100 list that I'm currently trying to complete. And I read half of this book 10 years ago, and since then I have had an inner struggle because I wanted to pick it up again, but I haven't been able to find it, or I have forgotten about it or something. And then recently I found this copy and I knew I had to get it. People either love or hate this book. I see a lot of diverse reviews on Goodreads. I'm one of those people who love it. I really enjoyed this story. You have to read this not as a story. It's not a story with a lot of action and a lot of plot. It's not like that at all. This is a story about life, and it's very philosophical. It comes with a lot of sentences about life, and it makes you think about life. And that's what I like about this book. It really is thought-provoking, as I said, and I just really like it. So if you want to read it, then do so, but remember that it's not really a story. There is a story in it, but it's not the story that's important in my eyes. It's all of the philosophical thoughts. And also it's very short. It's about 150 pages, so try and pick it up and see if you like it, but I definitely did, and I gave it 4 stars. And that is all I have to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed it. I will be back again soon with another video, and until then, have a great day. Happy reading, everyone, and bye bye.